Good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you are. And welcome to our 33rd class of 65 monthly Zoom hour. I'm David Roscoe, and along with Bob Hammond and Dennis Mack, hard to believe, but we've been coordinating this series for almost 3 years now. I want to start by saying that Dennis regrets that he isn't with us today for this very special program with Dan Hogan and Brad Hyman. But at this moment, Dennis is somewhere in the air between Istanbul and Ulaanbaatar, Mongolia. I should say that we have 155 registrants today from all around the country and several from Europe as well. And looking at the screen, it seems obvious that we have many couples that are joining us. So this makes this one of the largest attended events in our series. Several of Dan's family members are here, as well as a few close friends and some very important people in his support network. So I want to start by saying the class of 65 would like to extend a special welcome to all of you in Dan's network. Go ahead and wave your hand. We know your being with us means a lot to Dan. A few reminders. Everyone is now on mute. Please remain there unless you're called upon to temporarily unmute to ask a question. And starting now, you may post questions and comments to the chat. Just be sure that they're addressed to everyone so that we can see them. And in the Q&A session, our moderators will select as many of those as time allows to pose to Dan and Brad. A video recording of this event is going to be posted on the website on Monday next. And the last reminder, everyone is encouraged to stick around for the optional social time following the end of the formal program, which is at 5:30. I'm now going to turn this over to Bob, who will introduce our speakers and our moderators. Bob?
Thanks, Dave. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. In the interest of preserving as much time as possible for this afternoon's highly anticipated presentations and discussion period to follow, we've decided to dispense with the formalities of reviewing highlight biographies of our speakers and moderators and get right into the program. Very briefly, our classmate Dan Hogan is going to share his personal journey with us. Dan's physician, Dr. Bradley Hyman, will update us on the scientific and medical aspects of Alzheimer's disease. Sharing responsibility for moderating the question and answer session will be our classmate Jim DeAngelis and his wife Beatrice, joined by fellow classmate and a previous speaker in our Zoom series, Richard Hodis, MD, Director of the National Institute of Aging. Following the question and answer session, we'll return to Dan for his closing remarks. Dan, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. It's really wonderful to be here with all of you today. And I'm really honored to be part of what's been an amazing series of Zoom sessions. And I think we are a great team that's been assembled for this, and kudos to the committee on that score. It's amazing what they've been able to do these past couple of years. So I'd like to sort of dive right in with the moment that I first learned somebody's barking. I first learned definitively that I had Alzheimer's. It was in late April that I had a lumbar puncture test for Alzheimer's, which looks for amyloid plaque and tau tangles. So I had that in late April. It takes a while before the results come back. And I had sort of what I would call a real life-changing moment. It was Friday afternoon on May 5th when MGH said that my tests had come back. And at that point, David's got it up on the screen right now. You can see at the top, it's the test is for tau and beta, t-tau and p-tau and A beta 42, which are two proteins. that tend to develop either the tau develops tangles and the amyloid develops plaque. And you can see the score for me is in the lower right-hand corner with that plus sign, which I would say should be a minus sign. But anyway, if you look at it, it's actually off the chart in terms of tau, which goes to 150, and my score was 158.75. And then instead of just a raw score on the amyloid side, there's a index score, which is really some kind of ratio, I think. But that on that one, it should be above 68. And as you look at it, you can see that I'm not even halfway there. I'm sorry, am I correct on that one? In any event, yeah, I'm 0.8, and you're supposed to be above 0.8, and I ended up at 0.39. So this is you can take the slide down now, and this was a real life-changing moment for me, I have to say. It basically, I felt terrifying fear, depression, and being upset. It was a Friday night, so I had no one to talk to at the moment, and I did, however, at least in the next Tuesday, my neurologist, Dr. Wendy Yao, who may be on this call as well, I had a meeting that had been set up a long time before. So that was relatively lucky. And she had was able to sort of calm my fears some. And I'm getting a lot of noise in the background. I'm not sure if it's me or what. But
everybody, please mute.
Anyway, she explained that the fact that my scores were so bad wasn't necessarily indicating a correlation with what symptoms appeared or how fast they progressed. So that was, somewhat reassuring, but not too much. Anyway, I'd like to step back and just go, how did this all happen? Why did I get these tests? Well, that goes back to the late 20s, when I had sort of a traumatic therapy incident, and the result of which was that the stress that I felt in my lower back, that's where I usually felt it, moved to my neck, weirdly enough, and in my neck. And then I worried that, well, is that going to interfere with my brain, do something to my brain over time? And I know that stress is not good for the brain anyway. And it's something I worried about, didn't do much about until my late 60s, when I got worried enough to do a neuro psych exam, and that found at MGH, and that found no problem. I wasn't convinced myself. And then in October 21, I had a mild stroke at the squash nationals, and played through it. I actually played in the tournament, got back to Boston, ended up with an MRI and a CAT scan, and that suggested cerebrovascular disease. And I felt like I needed to really have another neuropsych exam, which I did in July last year. And in that, I was diagnosed with mild cognitive impairment, but no Alzheimer or dementia, at least in terms of symptoms that interfered with my daily living. Then in January, again on the squash court, I had this weird experience playing a 12-year-old in my age, it was my age category, in my skill level, which wasn't very high, but he was very good. And he came up and shook my hand and said, after what I thought was the first game, said, "Nice match." And I said, well, "Gee, I thought it's just the first game." He said, "No, I won 3-0." And I was sort of flummoxed and dumbfounded, but that turned out to be the case. And so there's no absolute diagnosis that I know of. They think maybe some kind of TIA, but it got me interested in seeing again, what would happen if I have another exam, neuropsych exam, which or neuropsych, I'm sorry, have a meeting with Dr. Yao, Wendy, which I did in March 27. And after her examination, she suspected that I had, as well as looking more into the Alzheimer's side, that I had some symptoms of Parkinson's. So I had a whole series of tests outlined, one of which was the lumbar puncture, which you saw the results from on the first slide. And then I had another test for PET scan, a special PET scan for Parkinson's, and had the proteins that are relevant there. Did a sleep study, and one of the ones, a sleep study, and I have a nice photo of what that was like, if you can show that. It's quite, you can see, it took them an hour to put it on. And I had a hard time sleeping, not surprisingly. But I did get to sleep finally. Anyway, the result of all that was a diagnosis of early stage Alzheimer's, Parkinsonian sort of Lewy body disease, and cerebrovascular disease. So that wasn't a very pretty picture as far as I could tell, and pretty depressing. And I mentioned, and I should mention something, but that goes into how this whole change in terms of my attitude came about. On Father's Day in 2017, I actually playing tennis doubles and serving just collapsed and fell backwards, and it turned out I had sudden cardiac arrest, but a surgeon on the next court happened to be a cardiac surgeon, started back surgery, not back surgery, started CPR with the doctor that was my partner. They traded off for 15 minutes. I made it through without, and the EMTs came after 15 minutes, got me to the hospital, took 4 blasts of the defibrillator to bring my heart back to beating. But I made it, and didn't have any apparent, some might think otherwise, brain damage from that at the time. And it's actually if you look up tennis with a dead man, you can read more about it. But within a week of feeling pretty depressed about this, I awoke one morning and it really was clear to me that what I wanted to do was to help others in dealing with Alzheimer's. So it brought me out of myself, and it really, and since then I have not felt depressed. I felt like I sort of have a real fundamental purpose that's pretty unshakable to do something. So one of the things that I think one of the most important parts of my story for me is the importance of having hope and being optimistic about it. I'll just read a sentence from Harvard's Human Flourishing Program that they published, a study of nearly 13,000 people with an average age of 66. They found those with more hope throughout their lives had better physical health, better health behaviors, better social support, and a longer life, and also led to fewer chronic health problems, less depression, anxiety. And so I think that hope is really, and optimism is an incredibly important part of things. I think I have a slide that may help with that, which. So David, can you put up the seconds? This is a movie that really depicts someone who is fiercely optimistic.
What are my chances?
Not good.
Not good, like 1 out of 100.
I'd say more like 1 out of 1,000,000.
So you're telling me there's a chance?
Yeah.
Anyway, I think that's a cute way of looking at somebody who's just eternally optimistic. And we know from the research that being optimistic and having hope is good for us. And so I choose to be, if your chances are only 10%, that means that 10% of the people do survive. 10% of the people may never get Alzheimer's symptoms, or those who have them, they may not deteriorate very much. And so I've just figured I might as well maximize my chances. And so that's what I'm doing. Now, I'd like to, let me see where we are here. I think a few basic facts are important just to briefly note, so because they illustrate how important, how big, how pervasive, how disruptive Alzheimer's is as a disease. With a third of us over 85 and older having it, and deaths topping more than breast and prostate cancer combined, and the national cost of $345 billion, it's really really impactful. Thanks, David. That's good. So in terms of what's happening in the medical world, I'm just going to spend like a minute or two on it because I'm sure that Brad will cover it in more detail, but just wanted to mention that's just a lot that I read about all the time. Every time I have a Google alert set to just the word Alzheimer's, that's it. And it's amazing what I get from that. But anyway, I'm on a couple. I've been on 2 different medications for symptom relief, which I think have been effective. But the first one had a lot of side effects, so I moved to another one. Everybody has probably heard about Leqembi, the brand name for lecanemab, and the Eli Lilly donanemab that's out, that is meant to slow the progress of the disease. And there are other therapies that are being repurposed. There's one for epilepsy and one for diabetes that's now being looked at as a way to slow down the disease progress of Alzheimer's. It's a Colombian extended family that has had where they die very early on. They get Alzheimer's really early on. And the doctors have found some of them here, I think at MGH, who have found that there's 2 different mutant genes which have allowed several members of the family to live sort of a normal lifespan. There's a lot of work going down in the testing and diagnostic field to lower the price of entry to getting good testing. So there's blood tests, there's a taste and smell test that's being explored, one for vitreous humor of the eye through postmortem analysis of brain and eye tissue that it seems to be related to Alzheimer's. So there's a lot going on. And so I'd like to turn everything over to Brad now for and we'll hear from him for a while on the actual science. So, Brad, you're on.
You know, before I say anything else, I just want to thank you for your courage in putting on this presentation, and really to thank all 118 participants who are supporting you on this journey. There's nothing easy about this, and your spirit of hope and your spirit of courage are just so moving to me and to all of us. So thank you, Dan.
Well, thank you, Brad.
You know, your commitment to making a difference and to helping others is really the spirit that so many of my patients have, and
Yeah.
is really what we need to make progress in this disease. And we're making progress, and I want to describe some reasons for hope. You know, we're not there yet, but I'm really, really, really optimistic we're going to be there, and you know, certainly in our lifetime. I've prepared some PowerPoint slides, and through the miracle of Zoom and the miracle of having done this once or twice before since the pandemic started, I've learned to always ask if people can see the slides.
Perfect.
All right, good. So I'm Brad Hyman. I'm the director of the Alzheimer's Disease Research Center here at Mass General, which is, of course, part of Harvard. We have been studying Alzheimer's disease for the last 5 decades or so, using every bit of clinical and molecular biology and biochemical measures that we can. And I'd like to just walk you through some of those experiences that we've had. But before I even start, I want to say that although, you know, clearly I've paid attention to what's happening at Mass General, really this is a worldwide effort. And I've listed just some of our collaborators and to highlight them, but they're people from all over the country and frankly from all over the world. And the spirit in the community, the culture in the community of investigators in Alzheimer's disease is exactly that. If you look at the names of the people who I listed who are members of my lab, they're also people from, you know, not just the United States, but again, all over the world who come and share their energy and their excitement, and then often go back to their home countries and establish programs there. And so I've really been privileged to watch this global emphasis on how to beat this really tough disease. And this, the core of all of this energy and effort is really the leadership that Richard Hodis has shown at the National Institute at NIH. And we'll be hearing from Richard later, but I can't be overemphasized how much that governmental intervention in a bad disease has led to the breakthroughs that I'm going to be describing today. PubMed is a searching tool. It's sort of a precursor to Google. And if you type in the words Alzheimer's disease into this searching database for all the medical literature in the world, there's over 170,000 articles that come back up. And you know, there's you can read every single one of those articles, and they kind of point in a lot of different directions. Everybody has their own pet theory, they have their own data, they have their own model system, they have their own whatever. But there's a few things that are absolutely not controversial. The first is that it is absolutely a difficult, awful disease, and affects more than 18 million Americans. And you know, literally 10 times that if you look around the world. And we sure ought to do everything we can to try to head it off and cure it. So what happens to the brain in Alzheimer's disease? Well, I'm going to highlight 4 different things that happen, and they all happen more or less concurrently. The first, and can you tell me, can you see the cursor as I move it around on the screen?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Yes,
So this is an MRI scan. And I bet many of you have had MRI scans over the years of some body part. This is the brain, and the outside is the skull, and then the inside here is this, looks a little bit like a cauliflower. It's a brain, and this is a healthy brain. And this is someone with Alzheimer's disease. And you can see that the ventricles, which are the fluid areas inside the brain, are much bigger, and the brain substance itself is much smaller. In fact, just the weight of the brain is reduced by between 1/3 and 40% in patients with severe Alzheimer's disease. And it just makes sense that if the brain loses brain cells, if it loses neurons, it's not going to think as well. So that's something that happens in which the brain is physically destroyed. There are three things that happen, which are new phenomena that occur in the brains of an Alzheimer patient that don't occur in a normal person. The first and the second are the things that Alzheimer himself saw under a microscope in 1906. And they're called plaques and tangles. And the plaques are made of a protein called A beta or amyloid beta. Those are synonyms. And the tangles are made of a protein called tau. And so I'll be talking a lot about amyloid or A beta and tau. And both of these lesions occur really throughout the entire brain, but they occur in a stepwise fashion as the disease progresses. And that's one of the things that I want to emphasize, is that this disease is insidious. It starts out and slowly accumulates over the years, as much as 2 decades, before it can really go from healthy to severely diseased. And so nothing's going to happen next week. You may as well do everything we can next week. The other lesion in the brain is markers of inflammation. So all this damage that occurs, the loss of the neurons, the presence of the plaques, the presence of the tangles, lead to a reaction of the cells in the brain that are responsible for protecting it from diseases. And those are inflammatory markers. They're called astrocytes and microglia. And these both become enormously activated in the brain. And it appears to many of us that the inflammation that occurs, the brain's own trying to fend off these other lesions, is actually part of the problem. And so just like in atherosclerosis, just like in arthritis, the body's defenses over time actually maybe cause additional damage to the organ at hand. This graph was published by Cliff Jack in the Mayo Clinic over a decade ago, and it was his model based on a variety of information, neuropathology and neuroimaging and biomarkers and so forth, about how the disease would progress. And I want to take a minute just to talk to you about it, because it's this 20-year time frame that makes the disease both so difficult to treat and also gives me so much hope that there will be a time when we can treat it and prevent it. The first of these lines, the yellow-orange line, shows the accumulation of the amyloid beta or the plaques. And that's one of the very, very first things that happens. And you can see along the x-axis, cognitively normal, MCI, minimal cognitive impairment. That's the diagnosis that Dan was given. Or dementia, which is a much more severe change in cognition than minimal cognitive impairment. And so you can see that these plaques accumulate, and actually reach a maximum pretty much before clinical symptoms occur. The next line are the tangles. They accumulate. And there's a lot of them in the brain by the time this minimal detectable clinical symptoms occur and continue to accumulate until finally they max out and cause the full-blown picture of dementia. Atrophy of the brain, the MRI scan, lags behind, is present by the time minimal cognitive impairment occurs, continues to accumulate until dementia. And then finally, memory function, which is the first symptom in the vast majority of patients with Alzheimer's disease, and ultimately even more clinical symptoms that are the clinical picture that we see as dementia. So this is a long period of time, and one of the goals of the field and one of the real breakthroughs that's happened really in the last 5 years is the ability to detect each of these lesions even before any clinical symptoms at all occur. And so that although sort of in the old days, when we waited until this point in the disease, till someone was really impaired before they got a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease. Now there's diagnoses that occur early on with a lumbar puncture, with the spinal fluid and so forth. Excuse me. So the disease process plays out over time, in which the tangles occur in one part of the brain, spread to the rest of the brain over the course of 15 or 20 years. Similarly, the amyloid starts in one part of the brain, spreads out over the rest of the brain. This process takes a long time. What triggers it to start in the first place? Dan mentioned the genetics, the individuals in Colombia who have an average age of onset of about 40 years old, so astonishingly young. There's now known to be 3 autosomal dominant genes, and they all increase the number of plaques that happen. There's tau mutations that lead to a very, very similar set of diseases that's not exactly Alzheimer's, but again, neurodegeneration with loss of neurons. And then recent genetic data point to the role of neuroinflammation, of astrocytes and microglia becoming part of the picture. Treatments, which are just coming online, are derived from understanding biology. So understanding the genetics led to the belief that these plaques were the most important thing because the genes caused plaques. And the very recent anti-plaque medications that Dan mentioned actually can clear plaques out of the brain. Even more excitingly, anti-tau agents appear to impact tangles. Very, very recent data. And now there's agents that are under development that appear to be able to impact neuroinflammation. What are the lessons we've learned? Well, not everything works as well as we hoped. Now, who here on the call has ever been in any circumstance in which everything worked as well as you hoped it would? Alzheimer's disease therapeutics are just the same way. Not everything works as well as we hope, and yet the progress that we're making gives me enormous hope. I'm going to outline some of those reasons for hope. Anti-amyloid drugs, anti-plaque drugs, because amyloid and plaque are kind of synonyms, are going to be on the market in 2023, FDA approved, ready to go. These are the data from the trial that led to FDA approval. Patients who had mild cognitive impairment or even mild dementia, so really at about this point in the graph, were treated with an antibody against amyloid for 18 months, and their clinical course was marked. Here we see the clinical course of people on the placebo or people who had the medicine. Now, the first thing you'll notice is that these two lines don't overlap, that the people on the medicine always are doing a little bit better than the people on placebo. And this is the first time in decades that we've had a drug that had made any difference at all in the course of progression. Incredibly exciting. What isn't perfect yet, though, is you'll notice that everyone continues to get worse. That the people on the drug get worse just less quickly than the people not on the drug. And so, as much of a miracle as this is, and as exciting as this is, the fact is it's not a complete miracle. We hope that if we start the drug earlier on, even before the amyloid has accumulated as much as it is, maybe at a point where we can detect the disease along the curve here, when people are completely cognitively normal, that we'll be able to head off the whole process. We don't know if that's going to be the case yet or not, but I think many people in the field believe that that's a very, very realistic shot on goal to really prevent the disease in the same way that, how many of you are taking statins, right? Lower your cholesterol level before you have a heart attack rather than waiting until after there's been damage to the heart. In the same way, if we can prevent amyloid accumulation before it accumulates to the point where there's damage, we might be able to help. Now, what about treating the disease after it gets further along? The ideal design of a trial would be that people on a placebo drug would just uniformly get worse. That's what the textbook says about Alzheimer's disease. People just uniformly get worse. I always am worried because not a single one of my patients has actually read the textbook or lives by what the textbook tells them they're supposed to do. This is actual data from 32 patients who we pulled out according to certain criteria who had Alzheimer's disease. In this particular graph, this is over time, so over 15 years. And 0 is normal, 3 is very, very, very mild symptoms, 18 is severe symptoms. There's some individuals who over the course of 2 or 3 years go from being, pretty much okay to being severely, severely, severely impacted. And other individuals, and this is what Dan alluded to, the order of 10 or 15% of individuals over the course of time really pretty much do okay. Nobody's getting younger, but they're not getting much worse. And what's different between this individual and this individual? Well, that's one of our goals. And we're beginning to understand a variety of factors that lead to the difference between this rate of progression and this rate of progression. And if we can fully understand that difference, we believe that therapeutics will follow. So why do patients progress? And why do they have different rates of progression? Well, we found that different properties of the tau molecule itself correspond with their rate of progression. So that for some forms of tau propagate or progress across the brain faster than other forms of tau. Why should some people have other different forms of tau than other people? Well, that's something that many labs around the world are trying to understand. And not a week goes by literally before there's another paper that suggests that. There are some genes that seem to predispose people to fast progression or slow progression. And I'll come back to this in a minute, but the gene that is most important in Alzheimer's disease is a gene called apolipoprotein E, which comes in several different alleles. They're called E2, E3, and E4. You inherit one from mom, one from dad. If you were lucky, you inherited E2s. If you were less lucky, you inherited E4s. The people who with E2s do really well. The people with E4s far, far less well. And then the third point that I want to make is this idea of resilience, that there are people who have plaques and tangles and yet really clinically do okay. When you look at their brains, there's far less neuronal loss, there's far less inflammation, and we don't know exactly why it is, but Dan alluded to 2 prominent cases where it seems as if inheritance of a special gene leads to the ability to sort of fend off the symptoms that occur from plaques and tangles. So the second thing, which is an exciting approach, reducing spread of tau across the brain. There's a couple of different approaches to do this, antisense and zinc fingers and others. Hot off the press, in just a few months ago, Biogen and Ionis reported top-line clinical results in just a handful of patients, in which they had PET scan imaging of tangles, and it seemed as if in at least 2 people, the number of tangles actually diminished over time. That had never been seen before. So just like the antibodies get rid of plaques, this agent, which is an antisense agent, seems to be able to diminish the number of tangles. Incredibly exciting. And hopefully the phase 2, the next phase of the clinical trial, will be starting in this very year. ApoE4, I mentioned, severe risk factor. ApoE2, opposite. It's a protective factor. It leads to resilience. Well, I mentioned that the best luck you have is if you inherit E2 from mom or dad. But if you happen not to inherit, there's gene therapy approaches now in which several groups are trying to design gene therapy to give people ApoE2. And a group at Weill Cornell in collaboration with Lexeo Therapeutics and Ron Crystal reported their first 2 patients in December of last year who had received gene therapy in which they received this protective gene, and the patients were doing okay. They didn't have any side effects from the gene therapy, and some of the biochemistry that they measured actually looked like it was improving. And then finally, what can we do to understand resilience? How can we understand those rare individuals who have plaques and tangles but no symptoms? Those individuals from the Columbia kindred who have inherited the most profound autosomal dominant cause of Alzheimer's disease and yet managed to hold it off into their 70s. What can we learn about resilience to Alzheimer's disease neuropathologic changes that will allow us to fight the disease even later on? And these studies are in its early stages, but again, it's so exciting to see the field develop the way it is. So we have reasons for hope for tomorrow. Neuronal loss, already some interventions. A-beta, one on the market. Tau, well, boy, I sure hope that those early results hold up and we'll be able to get rid of tau. Neuroinflammation, drugs in development already. All of these things, maybe some combination of them, will be important for getting rid of Alzheimer's disease. Now, I'm going to turn this back to Dan in a second, but what can we do today? Because a lot of what I've been talking about is in the laboratory for tomorrow. We can keep your brain healthy. Diet and exercise are the best we have in the NIH-sponsored SPRINT trial. Really a beautiful example of how you can change the likelihood of progression by everyday changes in your behavior, in your lifestyle, in your diet, and in exercise. We can maximize every day. Dan said it the best. Be optimistic, give hope, reach out, have social networks. Those things seem to make a difference, seem to really impact the rate of progression. And Dan again epitomizes this, making difficult decisions, having difficult conversations. That seems to help. You don't need to do this alone. And there's groups of people, physicians and healthcare professionals, but more importantly, your friends and your family who can provide support and can really make a difference. So I want to stop there and turn it back, thanking you for your attention, but turn it back to Dan and have him describe some of the day-to-day functions, some of the day-to-day things that he's done to make a difference in his own life. Thank you all.
Thanks, Brad. Oh, geez, that was amazing. At the beginning of what Brad was talking about, I was getting depressed again. But it wouldn't have lasted long, but it didn't even last. But it's really encouraging to see what's happening. That's really exciting. So I'm so glad that you were able to join us today. It's really amazing. So, and you helped me out in terms, because I know we're a bit behind, and I cover some of these. What I want to talk about is sort of lifestyle activities, practices, and attitudes that make a difference. And Brad has talked about the social engagement end of things, and I'll mention a few others. And then I also like Brad at the end. If I misspeak or am exaggerating something, for him to clarify, remark on it in the Q&A. But anyway, one of the things that I've been paying attention to is the Mediterranean style diet, and the importance of, like, I guess there's research now on olive oil being a somewhat of a protective and good to help, and some research on that come out. One of the things I'm really glad about is dark chocolate is supposed to be very good for you. So I'm into that in a big way. But exercise is also for me, I have also Parkinson's, and we haven't talked about that much, and I'm still learning a lot. But walking, vigorous exercise is really good for both Parkinson's and Alzheimer's. And walking is really good as well. I bike everywhere, and now I don't bike if it's less than a mile. I don't bike. I walk just to get that exercise. Muscle building is good, and these all have. I don't know whether you just call them correlational, but apparently doing it seems to make a difference. Another thing which is important for me, which I need to explore, is getting good sleep, and especially REM sleep. From what I understand, I'm low on that, and I'm just learning about it. You saw the photo of me all gussied up in wires and attachments. But meditation is good. Mental activity, I think there's some research on that in terms of, like, just doing planning, crossword puzzle, thinking, problem solving, that kind of thing. And I happen to believe in other practices, and have gotten a lot out of a lot of Eastern sort of philosophy and religion in terms of gratitude, thankfulness, and being present. I think being present is really living in the present. And I think having, when I got those diagnoses, I think that really, in some ways, I say God's been trying for a long time to get me to be in the present, and I have a tendency to want to think of the future and not just be there and enjoy what's going on now. And now I realize I had sudden cardiac arrest, so now I'm pretty much in the present as much as I can be. Anyway, and just in terms of things that I'm doing, I think a lot of times people don't realize the stage that they're at, and the worse it gets, the less they realize it. So I've told a group of my trusted family and friends and colleagues that I have Alzheimer's, and these are people with whom I interact in ways that I think some of the symptoms would be apparent. That I would like to have them be able to tell me if I seem to be going downhill. And if they are uncomfortable with that, to tell my partner, Jane, who's absolutely fantastic, and herself was a caretaker for somebody, her late husband had a bad back injury, and also had ended up having lung cancer and died a number of years ago. So she's been a caretaker but really making sure so that people could talk with her if they want to. And that gets at another important thing to do, which is to share important documents and information. My brother David, I can't see, I can only see a couple of people because I've made a small screen for that. My brother David may be online, and his daughter, who's only 42, died of a heart attack over a year ago. And she has a 12-and-a-half-year-old daughter herself. And there are no passwords for her computer, no knowledge about where important documents are being kept. And so it just created a real mess in so many ways for my brother, who had to take care of all these problems. And so it's really important for us, and we probably should be doing this anyway, because we could die at any moment, to make sure we've done that. So I have a sheet. I don't want to say where it is because I got to keep it. I'll tell. I know Jane knows where it is. That lists my passwords so that people can get into my computer. I have show you. I'm into computers, so I'm not using. But I'm dead now. What? And it's got all sorts of, it's got pages where you can write down your insurance policy numbers, all that kind of thing. But it is important to do that kind of thing. So that's one of the things I want to do in the next months is get my life in order, completely in order. Something people can do. This is just an odd line item, but in terms of if you're worried about Alzheimer's, I really strongly recommend that you try to do something about it in terms of getting tested. And it's a bit daunting. Part of the reason I told you the story, and I didn't tell all the problem parts about my getting finally tested, is that it's not that easy. Medicare doesn't makes you jump through hoops. Finding a neurologist quickly can take more than a year. But it's important to catch it in the early stage, as Brad recommended. And I'm hoping that I'm relatively early stage. And that's my hope. But one of the things you can do in terms of that is to sign up for a clinical study or a observational study. I'm in one at the Massachusetts Alzheimer's Disease Research Center. It's a lifelong study, and Brad's head of that center. And I did see Judy Johansson is on the call, and so she's the coordinator for that study. And all the people in the center and that I've been dealing with are just incredible people. So a real shout out to them as far as I'm concerned. It makes me feel like I'm not alone. So. And the final sort of really boring thing to talk about in this regard is the importance of legal docs and getting all your estate planning and getting a lot of legal documents done or redone, and doing it ahead of time or doing it as soon as. One of the items is the healthcare proxy, which is important. I have Jane as my healthcare proxy. So if I become incapacitated, she is able to take over. Something to be careful about are HIPAA authorizations, which specify who the hospital can talk with and get information from, and who can get information from medical providers. That needs to be, you need to be careful with that, because it's the last one you signed that is operative. And a lot of times hospitals will ask you to assign one when you come in, or they ask for yours. And then if they say, I don't know where it is, well, they'll give you one to sign. You have to be careful about that. You can have a durable power of attorney which is very important. You can have multiple. So my daughter and Sarah and Jane are both have a power of attorney, so they can act in financial and contractual issues, and it doesn't take it away from me, so they can do that. With the healthcare proxy, if I'm incapacitated, then my proxy has the ability and responsibility to make decisions for me. And this goes all the way, and this is a little bit not fun to talk about, but something to think about is, the whole issue of assisted death and do not resuscitate, signing to DNR documents. I think it's really important to think through what you want to do in that situation, because otherwise it's going to be in the hands of say, the healthcare proxy. And it's really, if you can be clear on what your terms are and have a side note in writing around that, and there's some legal documents you can use, a medical order for life-sustaining treatment that can be signed in this regard. But that's important, and that takes the pressure off the healthcare proxy in terms of how to make decisions. So, I think that's not it's not the most uplifting place to stop. And so I will, I'll do two more things before closing. One is just to say that there's incredibly good information out on the web, PubMed, and just doing Google searches. The Alzheimer's Association is really got amazing information. And there's growing care being brought to hospitals. At MGH, there's the Dementia Care Collaborative that I'm being inducted into, that helps with getting you a social worker, getting case managers, getting help for you, sort of in terms of living. And then you have these different centers like Brad's, which are absolutely wonderful. The website is excellent. And of course, we have Richard's National Institute on Aging. He's been the director of that for 30 years. And that's the largest funder of Alzheimer's research in the government that exists. Anyway, I'm deeply honored to have been asked to do this, to talk about my situation. I really hope that I provided some hope to those of you concerned in any way about the disease, and practice self-compassion. And I do think that purpose, if each of us has some kind of purpose, it's helped me. There may be other ways for other people.
Puppy.
I hope that I basically hope for each of us that we are more open to talking about Alzheimer's, getting help more early on and not waiting too long, and getting proper testing and treatment, and making some of these lifestyle changes and putting one's personal affairs in order. And most of all, I hope I've provided some increased hope and optimism for all of us as we continue our journey into the 80s. Thank you very much.
Rich, you want to start off with some Q&A, and then you'll be alternating with Jim and Beatrice?
Sure, happy to do that. Now, let me just to say just a few words in context relating to some of the things that you've just heard. First, the role of research and how it happens and how exciting it is. it doesn't just happen. It happens because of the support and commitment of all of you, of all of us. And as one illustration of it, in 2015, the total NIH investment in Alzheimer's research was just about $600 million. Now it's well over $3 billion. I mean, no other area has seen that much of an increase. And it's the reason that we know a lot of what Brad was summarizing that we've learned. The government has a role. So far, we've had enormous bipartisan, bicameral, executive, legislative support, and let's all hope that continues. But it's the support of all of you that are translated into all of this. And it's not just that NIH funding academic centers, it's the partnerships with industry. So the basic research needs to be done to make it an appealing place for industry to then invest. And you've seen that in some of the pharmacologic agents that are coming to bear now. So it's an enormous enterprise, depending upon the support of all of you. And we appreciate, I think, collectively as consumers and as well as the designers and supporters of all of this research. There are a number of topics I've seen in the chat that have come up, and one category of them that obviously is important to all of us is prevention. So if we can start there, perhaps as one, if people are interested, what can we do to prevent? Let me introduce the topic by making something of a distinction. First, we have identified a number of risk factors. That is, they're correlates. If you do something, it's good for preventing Alzheimer's. If you don't do it, it's bad. And NIH-supported research, for example, has shown if you look at 5 kinds of health behaviors, being on the right side of smoking or cigarettes or exercise or diet, can make a difference of nearly twofold in your risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. But because there's a risk factor, it doesn't mean that now we know what you can do that with certainty will reduce your risk. So the best kind of research we can do in that regard, and Brad alluded to some of this, is to design a clinical trial. It's just like an injection of a drug. We can design a trial to see what sort of behavior, non-pharmacologic intervention makes a difference. And probably the most telling case is the one he referred to as SPRINT, or the SPRINT Mind study. This was designed to see a few years ago whether if you controlled your systolic blood pressure, that's the high number of the two you get in your blood pressure, to 140, which was the conventional standard, or more aggressively, more intensively to 120. Was that better for your health or worse? Maybe low blood pressure wasn't so good. That study was stopped prematurely for ethical reasons because the group with a lower blood pressure did so well in terms of survival, heart attacks, and cardiovascular aspects that it was deemed unethical to continue it. Well, fortunately, we built into that study to cognitive tests and tests of MRI to detect lesions such as the white matter intensities that have been talked about here. And it turned out that more intensive blood pressure control led to a decrease in developing of mild cognitive impairment and some of these brain lesions. So this is now something that with the, if you will, the highest level of evidence we have, we can support for recommendations. For many of the other risk factors, the results are less extensive and are just coming in, but there are some. To name a couple of the interesting ones just in the last year or so, it's been seen for a good long time that sensory loss, like hearing loss, correlates with the risk of Alzheimer's disease. So a recent study just in this past year or so reported that if you take individuals older with some cognitive impairment, with high cardiovascular risk, and either do or do not correct their hearing with a hearing aid, the correction of their hearing actually decreases their cognitive decline. That is, it preserves cognition. Another study, and every time we hear one of these, they need to be repeated, we say, but there was a study designed to look to see whether cocoa extract as a source of antioxidants would be protective. So cocoa extracts versus a placebo. Placebo is a pill that looks like the one that might be active, but they actually threw in a third arm there, which was a multivitamin. And the results reported from that study were that the cocoa extract didn't do anything, but in fact, a multivitamin reduced cognitive decline. So I think I'm citing cases in which there undoubtedly needs to be repeated studies, but some of the most rigorous kinds of tests. When we talk about the rest, diet, exercise, social engagement, all these are very highly correlated. And I can say that right now, NIH and NIA are supporting many studies to look at just what kind of exercise or what kind of dietary change or what combination of them can make a difference. And so we're all looking for the results of these to emerge over the next months and years to enhance what we know we can do about things. So sorry for that. That wasn't moderating. That was just augmenting a little bit of some of the things that you've heard. But Brad, did you want to take on the response to some of the questions we've heard? One of the toughest ones, I think, there's no right answer yet, is should everybody be tested, or who should be tested now to see if they have the biomarker, the blood test, the PET scan that says you do or don't have a process underlying Alzheimer's disease?
Well, Rich, I'll say that is, something that we've, of course, talked about for years as these biomarkers and PET scans and so forth have come. And the easy answer was always, well, why look? There's nothing we're going to do about it, right? I mean, everybody should be healthy. Everybody should get their blood pressure under control. Everybody should, have their cataracts out and their hearing aids, fixed and so forth. But now we are really entering territory where we haven't been before. In the next few months, we're going to be able to access for patients this new generation of drugs that'll be on the market. And they're not perfect. They don't do everything, but it really gives us a balance of risks and benefits that are going to have to be weighed. And our own feeling is that, and this is maybe just me talking rather than any sort of broad policy statement, but everybody's different. Every single one of my patients' circumstances is different. I mean, I was smiling to myself when I heard Dan, and I was, I often use this phrase that none of my patients read the textbook, and it wouldn't matter if they did. But the textbook certainly does not reflect any individuals who first became worried about a diagnosis of memory impairment while they were playing squash with a 12-year-old, right? No textbooks at all talk about playing squash with a 12-year-old. So, everybody's different, and I think we now have something to do about it, and it's on docs to have difficult conversations with people and say, do you want to know? If you do want to know, this is how we can find out. This is the consequence of finding out. And some people are going to want to find out and other people aren't. And right now, I think we need to just listen, speak clearly, and then listen carefully to what our patients want.
Yeah, and to the theme you mentioned about no two individuals being alike in who's going to benefit more or less from a treatment, who's at a higher risk for an adverse effect, a side effect. We're going to now, as these drugs become available widely, have to do something beyond what we've done in clinical trials. We're going to have have an effective means to monitor all of the patients in the community who are getting these treatments, to try to understand who the ones are at greatest risk for problems and who are those who are most likely to benefit. And then in an ongoing way to translate the surveillance into modifying what we do to target the right treatments for the right individuals. And Brad, you might want to comment too, when people have looked at the brains after death, of course, of people with Alzheimer's-like dementia, the findings have shown a remarkable multiplicity and heterogeneity of different kinds of pathology. No two brains alike, just like no two people alike, which has implications for how to know in all these people, which processes are the ones causing the cognitive impairment, and in those individuals, which are the ones who need what targeted treatment. You see this in the future.
Absolutely, Richard. And a number of years on the planet, things accumulate. And so often Alzheimer's disease is a major contributor, but equally common, maybe even more common than average, that something else is going on too. And sometimes 3 things, sometimes 4 things. And that's true of every single organ system in your body. It's true of your brain also. So one of the reasons for heterogeneity of rate of progression might be that people who have Alzheimer's disease and also something else, well, that's tougher on the brain than just having one or the other. We've looked into that, and even when you limit it to just people who had only Alzheimer's disease, as far as we can tell as mere mortals, there's still an amazing amount of heterogeneity, and there's still about 15% of people who do really, really well, and maybe 15% of people who, unfortunately do really poorly. And so there's heterogeneity on heterogeneity. It's why one of the things that we're focused on so much is going back to the individual and asking, what is it about this person that's directing their disease?
Yeah, even when we're dealing with things that we think we understand, like genetics, we see how complex they are. So ApoE4 was mentioned. Bad thing is to have ApoE4. But in the last year, a report, which looks quite extensive, showed that if you look in Native American, American Indian populations, which had been understudied, ApoE4 doesn't matter at all. It's not a risk factor.
Mhm.
And this is one of the examples.
Africa, the same way.
This is a place we have to do better. And looking at diversity of the populations studied, not just those who are convenient and accessible, but the broadest scope of participants. If they're all going to profit, if we're all going to profit maximally from understanding what goes on.
If there's a pause, Beatrice and I would like to get into this conversation. And the first thing I'd like to say is that there are all these things that Dan laid out that he has been doing to prepare his family, his friends, for what's coming at some point. And of course, that's a very important point. And I'd like to kind of focus on that a little bit and ask a couple of the people who have asked questions or made comments to elaborate on their questions. But before I do that, I want to say something emphatic about diet. First of all, Beatrice and I are Mediterranean eaters. Last night I was cutting vegetables for the ratatouille. It's the first point. Second point is that if you look at the chat, if you haven't looked at it lately, there is a discourse among our classmates and others, I guess, about several things, but the most interesting one I found was about chocolate, dark chocolate. And I would encourage you to look at that and appreciate, how dark chocolate is a part of many of our lives, I guess. Certainly Beatrice's. And now.
Here. I'm for it.
The first thing I'd like to focus on, or we would like to, is looking at something that Kyle Pruitt wrote to us. And some of you may have seen this, but I'm just going to read it to you and ask either, Dan and Brad and maybe Richard to just comment on it. Here's what he said. He said, having difficult conversations is probably not a universal skill in our generation. Can Dan and or Brad talk about how to get started and why they are so important to not avoid? And Dan, maybe you want to start with this because I think you touched on it, but not in such a, an analytic way, as I think Carl was suggesting.
I can tell you how I did it, and I can tell you that it was with a lot of trepidation. I was coming back from, we have a group of I went to Exeter Academy, and we had a group from 4 different states that meets every once in a while for lunch. And hold on a second, I'm hearing something.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
I drove down from seeing my son, and we stopped in New Hampshire for the lunch we were having in New London. And on the way, I really didn't know whether I wanted to say. I just said to myself, I believe this is important. I'm tired of not being able to say something to somebody. They say, "How are you?" And a lot of times I will just say, "Yeah, I'm fine." But I didn't want to feel alone. I guess that's a part of it. I also didn't want to feel like when I forget names of people that it's just scary to me about, well, how could I possibly forget their name and what must they think if I say, what's your name again? Or you try to avoid it, but then people know you're avoiding it. And so I just did it. I said, I'm going to talk with the group and let them know. So I waited until everybody had ordered lunch and it quieted down, and then told them, and it was really a positive experience. And so I think and I have to say, another thing, it makes it easier for people to talk to you, and a number of people that I've talked to have been appreciative of the fact that it makes them easy to talk to me, which helps having a relationship with somebody. They're not afraid of what to say. But I do think that may not be the best answer to your question. But I have experienced almost only positive responses, and I've learned a lot, and it's been really meaningful to me.
If I may, I'll move to another question that came in before the session. It came from Dorsey Garner and his wife, Nia Wrong. And they were asking about a program that I believe has to do with diet and some other things, and has been around for a while. They just want to know what the status of that is. It's something called the Bredesen protocol or diet program. Is this something that Brad or Richard could speak to briefly? I don't know anything about it.
No, it's a diet which is a pretty strict diet, and a whole protocol. And there are people who really swear by it and say that they feel better on it. I've just anecdotally some patients who have been on it who honestly it didn't agree with them, and they felt sick on it all the time. And because everybody's different, and it seems to me like in many instances, if you're on a very, very strict diet and it's not scientifically 1,000% clear that this is doing you good, but it's making you constipated or diarrhea. I'm just a neurologist, but I'm not a fan of either of those. And maybe that's why I became a neurologist, but it's instead of some other kind of doctor. But it seems like for some people that appear to feel better on it and do okay, and other people not. And I don't think, and Richard, maybe your perspective would is broader than mine, but I don't think that there's a scientific consensus on whether it broadly does a lot of good.
I think that's
Now,
fair to say. There are a number of efforts to try to understand what lifestyle changes individually or collectively might work and work best. And we've talked about some, try exercise alone, try a diet alone, but there are also those that target combinations. And the first large study of that was reported was called FINGERS. The Fin is because it was done in Finland. And very appropriate. They took a bunch of people and tried to analyze for each of them what their risk factors might be, if it was exercise or diet, and then target modification. And they reported some improvement in preservation of cognitive function. There's currently a global and US one going on that went from FINGERS to Pointer, which is doing the same in this country. It's a trial to try to identify in each individual what might be the health behaviors, not just diet, but including diet, that are most effective. And we'll be seeing, again, over these next months, how effective such an approach may be.
Thank you. Now, something I think is very special that we did not anticipate until a couple days ago. Our classmate, Peter Barnett,
Your book.
wrote the following. I'm looking forward to our Zoom. And Peter, I'm going to ask you to unmute in a minute or so and ask your questions. But I want the people to know what you wrote. My wife, Sissy, died in January after a 9-year struggle with Alzheimer's, the last 4 in an institution. 3 years ago, I wrote a book about our experience with this disease as a tribute to her and to aid other spousal caregivers just entering into the struggle. it is not technical, but rather a human story that reads like a novel titled Losing Sissy, Saving Myself, The Perils of Caring for My Wife Through Her Memory Loss. Now, our copy is in the mail. It'll be in our house tomorrow, and I'm looking forward to reading it. But here, Peter goes on. If we lived in Paris, the book is published in English and French editions, available on Amazon. I am awed by Dan Hogan's courage talking with us, and am certain I have common questions for Dr. Hyman, including his view on the eventual curing of this disease and whether research is sufficiently focused on a cure as well as solely early development. I would just add that I think your comments, both Richard's and Brad's, have addressed that, but I do want you to kind of focus, I want Peter to focus on what some of the things that Dan has said, and we'll twist it around a little bit, because Dan is not the caregiver, Jane is. And Peter and I have some commonality there because of my wife Beatrice's illness. But I'd like, Peter, if you would, to ask Dan in a more effective way than I can, I think, whether there are things that he's thought about doing in the context that he's already spoken, that he and the rest of us should know about, as not the caregiver, but the recipient of care. Peter?
That's it. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
That's it.
That's a great question. Let me start by saying that I've been fighting with this terrible disease for 9 years now, and I lost the battle, as did my wife, in January. But my experience is really from the caregiving side, not from the disease itself. I was tremendously encouraged by what Brad had to say today about where you think you guys may be going. And I'm not sure that's generally understood at nearly the depth that it needs to be, in a sense, because the hope is there. And that was very exciting. In your case, Dan, I'm in awe about what you've done and how you're handling this, and that you had the courage and purpose to step out in front and talk to people openly and candidly about the disease from your point of view, etc. And I think that's terribly unusual and terribly important. When Cece first entered an institutional situation, which was 4 years ago now, a young psychologist on the staff there said to me, we don't know yet how to take a journey through somebody else's mind. We have not been able to figure that out. Their brain we can get through, but not what they're thinking, of course. And I think you've given us more insight today on what you're thinking and how you approached it. And I think you're a role model, because there are two things that make you totally unique in my experience. You're willing to talk about it. You're not keeping it a secret. You're out in the open with it. In my experience, and friends, and I have quite a few of them who have the disease, they all don't want to tell anybody. They want to keep it a secret, and prevent themselves from communicating, which I suspect you're asking the question is, how can you get more people to understand this and get engaged? You got to get over the fear factor. They feel that somehow they are not right anymore, and if they talk about it, others will reject them, or or things like that. It's the fear factor. It's also if they're not sure what the problem is, they don't want to talk about it. So they've got it all wrong. The fact is, if you don't talk about it, you'll make it far worse for yourself as well as for other people. People will rally and help. There's a great fear of losing friends. And I know several people who have lost friends over this disease and help them reconnect, including a classmate of mine, of ours, by saying, talk to each other. Don't hide these things from each other. And your friends will rally behind you. The fact that you're doing this, Dan, will probably very much make your social life far richer going forward than it would have been if you had kept this all to yourself. And clearly, and I'm excited to see from Brad and others, is that we know more that the social friendship of others is very important to the health of the person who has the disease. So it confirms my thoughts, which is what I prepared some thoughts today, which was the two things that I think are the biggest mistakes people make. First is denial of the disease, which delays action and adds to loneliness and confusion. And the second is keeping it a secret. They're working. You had the wisdom to understand that, Dan, but I think you are a relatively rare, wonderful, rare example of a much better way to get at solving this as best you can. And I absolutely, in fact, I'm active with Alzheimer's in France and in fundraising and various things. And the book in two languages is used regularly in French retirement homes for Alzheimer's people, so that the caregivers in there get a better idea of what my wife was all about and what I was all about, and how all that helped them do their jobs better, because you cannot be a caregiver, professional caregiver, unless you like people and compassion and have these things in you. This is a terribly hard job, and you have to have a passion for it. My caregiving experience is the hardest thing I've ever done in my life. I also think it's the best thing I did in my life.
Okay, normally we stop at 5:30, but I think we're gonna formally go on for another 10 minutes so we can get a couple more questions in. And then at 5:40 Eastern time, we're gonna declare this formally over, but I urge people who want to stick around to stick around. I think Brad, do you understand this? Brad and Richard, the whole crew is going to be sticking around. So we're going to sort of phase in from formal to informal, and anybody who wants to stay as long as we can. If we end up with lots of people, we may go into a few breakout rooms so that people can talk amongst themselves, or not. We will figure that out once we get to the 5:40, 5:43, because I've been talking for a minute and a half here now. So Richard, go ahead and continue the Q&A.
Well, anyone who's online who wants to, in addition to chat, maybe just go off mute.
I'd like to just quickly respond to Peter. I really appreciate what he had to say. It really meant a lot. I mean, and I think he's really on target. For me, it was a really difficult thing to do. When I was driving down to New London from Burlington, Vermont, I vacillated all the way down. Should I, is this stupid? Are people going to think I'm am I going to ruin the conversation? But it didn't turn out that way at all. But it's really difficult. And something else, a correlate of not talking, I really think that caretakers have a real issue of being isolated because it's so time consuming to be that. And especially if you're not supposed to talk about it, or if the person you're caretaking doesn't want to talk about it, then it becomes even harder. But anyway, I appreciate what you had to say. And I feel blessed by how people have reacted.
Good for you.
Well, maybe take from Dan and to you, Peter. Peter, you've written a book. What can you do to help share these perspectives with the broadest number of individuals and let them see the light? Have you seen, Peter, for example, in response to the book, feedback that lets you think we can communicate effectively with people and change their inclinations?
I think we can. I think you have to keep it very human and very simple, which is why I also wrote the book from the point of view of a story, not a technical thing. There's no science in it. There's none of that. It's just what was this journey like, and how do people change over time, and how does the victim change over time, and what do you have to do? And you realize that as this disease progresses, that the sick person, more than anything else, needs love, needs positive reinforcement, constantly told that whatever he or she is doing is great and how smart they are, or whatever, so that their sense of self-worth is maintained as the thing progresses, and that they need people desperately. The more people in their lives, the better it's going to be. This is a huge social component, which is coming back to why you're doing this so well, Dan, because you maintain the social, where most people hide from it and then get lonely and isolated, and it just makes everything worse. So I've gone around to the book, and I've spoken to a few groups and stuff about it in terms of the experience, which I think very much, and I would like your reaction here. I think is the same story from the other side of the coin, from the caregiver's perspective.
Just putting this openness and it's a great conversation in context. Not so long ago, in the life frame of some of us, nobody talked about Alzheimer's. The stigma was too great. And among the events we all remember were the then former President Reagan revealing the impact that had at a national level in terms of discourse was quite extraordinary. But it's not over and it's not done. So this kind of conversation about how we can best share and communicate this openness and the importance of sharing experiences the way we're doing now, scaling it up beyond just the class of 65 is awfully important for all of us, I think.
Dorsey, you had a question?
Well, I mean, my question is the incidence of Alzheimer's different in different cultures, which might have different, obviously, genetic makeups, but also different diets. And Nee has been reading this book, The End of Alzheimer's, which ties Alzheimer's to a diet. And her background is she has a Ph.D. in nutrition. I sort of said she admits herself 30 years out of date in terms of, the science and so on. But, and the fact, my initial reaction was strictly skeptical, but the fact that it takes years for the disease to manifest itself, whether or not during that time, people's diets just sort of make themselves sort of destructive. Is the incidence of Alzheimer's the same in Japan, or everybody talks about people living forever in Georgia, in Russia? Do they have as much Alzheimer's? What are the numbers on that question?
Brad, you can try. The part of the answer is that we need to know more than we know now, because, for example, the testing to diagnose, to call Alzheimer's disease in different parts of the world is different. So if one's looking for real apples to apples, if you will, comparable comparisons, it's challenging. Among the research enterprises that may go there, there's a series of studies that began in the United States called Health and Retirement Survey, because it was feeling people around the age of retirement. But it now has some sister studies, if you will, in large parts of the world. So India, China, Europe, parts of Asian countries. So now we can begin to do this kind of comparison, testing people the same way to see what the answer is. And that'll give a more definitive answer. We know within our own country, for example, the data look fairly clear. Black African Americans have maybe twice the incidence as European Caucasians. Hispanics, maybe 1.5 times the incidence. Native Americans, American Indians don't do well. How much of this relates to genetics? How much it relates to diet, to education? So many factors that might play a role, but certainly trying to unravel those has got to be important in helping us to figure out what's happening. I thought you were beginning to ask a slightly different question. Is Alzheimer's becoming more or less common or prevalent over time? And we went through a series of studies, right, Brad, in which the trend in the United States and a number of countries seemed to be a decreased risk of Alzheimer's disease. And it was when people looked to what correlated, one large variable that came out was education. There's a very strong effect of education on risk of Alzheimer's. So if you compare populations, Black, white, not less than high school, more than high school education, you get a huge spread in the risk, if you follow them over time, of developing Alzheimer's disease. So unraveling what those are, you can imagine the correlates of being Black or white or educated or not will include diet and exercise and stresses, interpersonal interactions, so many of those things that we're really at the stage now trying to parse them out, unravel them to find out which are the important variables. But there's got to be a lesson there by the fact that there are all those differences. Brad, if you want to...
Yeah, Richard, I just add one other thing which has always been fascinating to me, is that right now most of those studies are basing the diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease on a clinical impression. So people aren't thinking as clearly as they used to. And I remember that one of the pioneers in the field, a neurologist named Bob Katzman, who was at Albert Einstein for many, many years and then finished his career in this last decade at UCSD, became fascinated by the idea that in mainland China, there were very few reports of Alzheimer's disease. And he actually launched a journey to mainland China. This is now, 30 years ago, and interviewed individuals and tried to do a population-based assay. And his conclusion was that in China, it was considered to be impolite to say that an elder was not doing well. And so no one reported that there were problems. But if you gave the elders formal testing, they had every bit as many problems as anywhere else in the world. And of course within some area. And so there's these cultural issues beyond hypertension and education and diabetes and all those other things that are sort of medical model. And yet there are these cultural issues also, which lead to differences in the diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease or of dementia, and even maybe the perception of it, that, what's normal aging versus what's, really a disease process. That perception varies across different cultures. And so as Richard said, it's a complicated issue, which I think is just fascinating and comes back to a mantra that I've repeated now a dozen times. You have to look at the individual in the context of their culture, in the context of what their life experience has been, in the context of their medical illnesses, to really try to understand what's going on with that person, rather than trying to make these sort of global entries.
Yeah, not to over intellectualize this, but we could answer that very important question now in a different way, and should be able to do it fairly soon. What do you think, Brad, with blood tests? I mean, if one's asking about Alzheimer's disease as defined by the plaques and tangles, and now for all these populations, we have blood samples that track with their self-perceived or diagnosed clinical state, and this is a whole nother dimension that's going to help inform us just what it means to say there are differences, cultural, biological, or a combination thereof across populations.
Years ago, I had an uncle who had ulcers, and he was always drinking warm milk. And then somebody woke up and said, wait a second, it's a problem that can, it's a bacterial problem. People stopped drinking warm milk and taking pills, and that solved the problem. And perhaps, and what you just said about other cultures, you've talked about the cultural aspects, but we're dealing now in a world of clinical trials where you have hard evidence, at least in this country, that seems to be pretty well. But I'm not hearing that you have that same kind of clinical studies going on in other countries.
Well, some are global, and in fact, some of the studies we're talking about, like lecanemab, they're international. They're not representative. They're not global, but it's not limited to the United States. And again, there were so many studies that were done in many countries where a part of the routine was to take a blood sample and store it. Now, how well, Brad, those samples were stored, whether they're amenable to the right kinds of tests, we don't know, but there may be quite a treasure trove, if you will, of information there collected over years on diverse populations that can give us rather quickly some new insights.
You have any familiarity with Scott Gazelle, who's at Harvard, who does a lot of work in, in testing with, I guess, tests. It's all diagnostics using proteomics or whatever. Is that something that is a coming?
Oh yeah, Brad could probably speak to it too, including the Harvard angle. But yes, in addition to looking at the blood test that we think is the protein we want to look at, a very important direction now has been to take advantage of our ability to do high throughput multiple tests, look at any and all proteins in the blood, for example, and see which patterns, not just one molecule, are relevant. And there have been some very interesting studies already there around Alzheimer's to point to specific proteomic or other metabolomic blood test patterns, complex patterns that give insights into the disease process and risk. Brad, I don't know if you want to talk further.
Yeah, no, I think you hit the highlight there. The fact is that the technology is moving at light speed here. So, 10 years ago, to do proteomics, you'd be lucky if you got 70 or 80 identifiable proteins from a tissue sample. Now, the one group says 5,000 and the other group says, no, we can do 7,000. And then a few weeks later, a new mass spec, is released on the market, and we're up to 10,000. And the sky's going to be the limit on that. And
one very positive thing I think this brings to mind is the culture of data and data sharing, which I think has just enormously improved over the past years. With this wealth of data available, now routinely, certainly required by any of the studies that we would support or fund, the data have to be made publicly available. So the data are deposited in databases that are accessible to anyone. And some of the most imaginative studies using those data are coming from people who never did the experiment at all, didn't generate those samples. But this openness, transparency didn't come easy to all fields of science, but I think we're profiting now from a great social change in the right direction here. I don't know if you feel this too.
I would add that for Europe, and certainly for France and the United States, you have culturally about the same kind of thing going on. The rate of the growth of the disease has been at about the same pace. The amount of organizations that are involved in trying to find cures and everything else, and everything else is about the same. The big difference between the United States and France is part of is I think if we're going to find a cure, it's going to be found in the United States. And one of the factors will be just the scale of the investment that we're able to put against this disease in the United States. Now, the French can't possibly do what we can do because we're 6 times bigger anyway as a nation. So there's a lot more money being thrown at it too, along with, you know, all the fantastic things that we have medically. But the French are a strong medical country too. So
I think we're going to have to stop. And I know, Dan, you wanted to close with a couple of remarks. And if you do, why don't you sort of wrap it up for us?
Okay. I actually, in part, want to just thank a lot of people, you know, and including our Yale class, I mean, and Yale classmates. I love our classmates, and they mean a lot to me. And I was just looking now. I haven't had a chance to look through all the pages, but just to see all of you who are here means a lot. And Brad, I'm just so happy that you were willing to help out in so active a fashion. And Richard and Jim and Beatrice and Denny Mack, who's not here, and Bob Hammond, who is. I just think all of you deserve great praise for this program, including the Yale University staff who put this on and help out with the back end. I guess Stephanie Hartnett and Modesta Gooding, Matos Gooding. And then the Brad, I just think the Massachusetts Association Alzheimer's Disease Research Center is a wonderful resource. And I wanted to thank Wendy Yao and Judy Johansson and my cousin Isaac Friedman. I don't know if he's on the call, but he's at MGH. And Jane Lawson next to me right now is absolutely indispensable. And my children, I don't know if, I know I saw Matt and Sarah and my other daughter Haley. I hope that they're, you know, they mean the world to me, and they've been great in terms of talking about it, which is not easy. And then I would never have made it through life without all the health and wellness professionals. So I want to mention Susan Walker and Hillary Illick, Faisal Alam, Elizabeth Evanson, Bessel Vanderkook, Hari Khalsa, and Carol Becker. I've been blessed in many ways and very lucky to have so much help, friendship, and love. Thank you, and God bless. You are on the road, must have a code that you can live by, and so become yourself, because the past is just a goodbye. Teach your children well, your father's health did slowly go by, and feed them on your dreams. The one they pay, so what you'll know by. Don't you ever ask them why. If they told you, you would cry. So just look at them and sigh. And know they love you. You
and you see
of winter year, Can't know the fear that your elders grew by. So please help them with your youth. They seek the truth before they can die. They teach your parents well. Your children's hell will slowly go by, and feed them on your dreams. One they pick, it's the one you'll know by. Don't you ever ask them why. If they told you, you would cry. So just look at them and sigh. And know they love him.
He's the one with Alzheimer's, but I'm the one that forgets all the lyrics.